Good afternoon. I'm Steve Forrest, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for the very first virtual summer up north. Now, I have to tell you, I have to warn you, I am dialing in from another part of rural America, which is Vermont, and my video and audio can be troublesome at times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my video so you will hear me as a disembodied voice. If something goes wrong with the internet gods, we have plenty of people who know how to fill in. So let me do that, and then I'll continue with the program. So first of all, I'm really amazed. We have 155 people here, so this is great attendance. This year is a bit different. Previously, this was a summer gathering of Wolverines from up north in Michigan. But this year we've extended the invitation to a broader audience from the larger Great Lakes area. So we're all glad you could join us. I think we'd all rather be up north, however. As I mentioned, I'm Steve Forrest. I'm a professor at the College of Engineering and the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. My research focuses primarily on solar cells and organic light-emitting devices. I also help lead several and community organizations that connect my professional life with my personal passions. I think chief among these is the University Musical Society, where I was chair for some years. And I'm basically trying to make a positive impact on the challenges our world faces today. So one of the issues I care deeply about is climate change. And so U of M President Mark Schlissel asked me and my colleague, Jennifer Haverkamp, who you'll hear from soon, to co-chair the UM President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality. Today, I'm excited to host our discussion about sustainability and the Great Lakes, and to share some of the great work underway here at the University of Michigan. We have a really terrific panel of UM experts here today, including Tom Baird, Vice President for Development, Carol Bradford, Executive Vice Dean for Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer, Michigan Medicine, Jonathan Overpack, the Samuel A. Graham Dean for the School of Environment and Sustainability, and Jennifer Haverkamp, the Graham Family Director of the Graham Sustainability Institute. Throughout the program, we encourage you to submit questions you have through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We already have several questions, so that will start off our panel discussion at the end of the presentations. But please, any questions that you might have, you can add them. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Tom Baird, VP for Development at U of M. Tom?
Thanks, Steve, and good afternoon. It's really great to see you all here today virtually. Before we dig in, I'd like to provide just a brief update on what is happening at the University of Michigan. Even with all of us working remotely, it's been a very, very busy spring and summer, and I'm sure it's been that way for you in your lives as well. So I'm sure you've all heard that the university, that we have announced our plans to offer a public health informed in-residence semester in Ann Arbor this fall. I'm very excited about that. It will be a mixture of in-person and remote classes. We have hundreds of members of the university community who have worked hard on our plan, and this process has been led by some of the top public health experts in the country, such as Dean Du Bois Bowman from the School of Public Health, who has also helped guide the state of Michigan in terms of the coronavirus crisis and helping Michigan prepare to bring society and the economy online, helping the governor and many others. Every decision that we've made has been focused on protecting the entire university community while also fulfilling our public mission to provide a high quality educational experience. And I'm confident that we have a very balanced and very flexible approach given all the uncertainties that we're all facing along the way. Most importantly, I'm so grateful to people like you who over the years have made sure that Michigan can tackle challenges like this through your support, and I just appreciate that so much. It's really important. There still is a lot of work to be done. In the development community, we've added some new priorities to help us with these transitions over the next 6 to 12 months. to add on to the work that we're doing consistently with our schools, colleges, and units. So for the near term, in the development community, we're working on three major priorities. The first one is health, safety, and the campus experience to help make sure that Michigan has the resources to reactivate our campuses in a safe and high quality manner. We're focused in this area. This includes extensive investment in testing and tracing and adjusting also our living and teaching environments for safety. And we're also thinking hard about the innovative and adaptive instructional methods that we can bring on board to make that remote learning experience more productive. Again, I mentioned just briefly, we're going to be focused on expendable student support. I think we can all imagine with the recent unemployment rate in the state of Michigan of over 20% and high unemployment across the country, many of our Michigan families have suffered economically through this pandemic. So we expect a significant increase in the need for student support. So we're going to be working hard to ensure that all of our students have the resources that they need to secure and complete a University of Michigan education. And finally, we're looking to invest in research related to COVID-19, including how the disease has affected our society more broadly. That brings me to our next guest, Dr. Carol Bradford, who can really very clearly share the amazing work that Michigan medicine has done during this time of COVID-19. Dr. Bradford is the Executive Vice Dean for Academic Affairs and a Chief Academic Officer for Michigan Medicine. She is an internationally renowned head and neck cancer researcher and surgeon with a long list of accolades, including being the first woman of the American Head and Neck Society and a member of the prestigious National Academy of Medicine. She's also a true Michigan woman. Dr. Bradford earned her BS, her MS, and her MD at the University of Michigan. Dr. Carol Bradford, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for that most gracious introduction. It's really great to be with all of you here today. My only regret is that we're not in one of my favorite places on the entire planet, which is up north, when oftentimes summer up north is when I'm also spending the week at Camp Michigania. So I'm going to just briefly highlight the tremendous work done by our colleagues and a huge array of workers at Michigan Medicine and how we responded to this COVID-19 pandemic. First and foremost, I want to express my great pride and my deepest gratitude to the men and women of our organization who not only responded to the call during this crisis, but really exemplified the very best of what Michigan medicine is all about. So, as you know, we've thrived and endured pandemics. In fact, some time ago, probably most of us weren't here yet, we enjoyed a fair amount of notoriety with the 1918 pandemic because of the leaders from the University of Michigan who were involved at that time. Our historians have really put the University of Michigan on the map with regard to pandemics. Our own director for the Center of History of Medicine, Dr. Howard Markel, also a medical school graduate. He was my classmate in 1986. He, in fact, coined the term flattening the curve, which has been a driver for the approach our country has taken to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our communities have really done a great job of flattening the curve and allowing us and other healthcare organizations to treat our COVID-19 patients. It's truly imperative that we keep the curve flattened in order to ensure that we can treat all patients who seek our care. I would like to acknowledge the spirit and unselfishness of our students. In early March, we followed the advice of our national organizations and removed our medical students and actually all of our health science students from patient-facing clinical rotations in recognition that the opportunity to learn was scarce and PPE was also scarce at this time. We were really in the midst of a crisis. However, not surprising to any of us, they did not sit idly by during the pandemic, even when their learning environments were disrupted. The Response Corps, which is our community outreach, and they really took quick action to assemble a wonderful learning opportunity. An 8-week pandemic course, which is going to be vital to the practice of medicine moving forward, showed that our students were more than willing to serve our communities and also that they wanted to learn from these historic times. So they showed an immediate desire to help in any way they could. They staffed education of how to don and doff personal protective equipment, wear for thousands of Michigan Medicine employees. They also staffed the Volunteer Donation Center, and they also participated in virtual prenatal care visits and calls. And they've truly been wonderful representatives of the community of Michigan Medicine. So many of you might be wondering, where do we stand right now? As of yesterday, Michigan Medicine has only 9 confirmed adult patients in the hospital and 1 confirmed pediatric patient. We have discharged more than 600 patients to a home or to a facility. You can see we peaked at about 230 patients and we were really, along with New York, in the first wave of the pandemic, and we were really learning as we went. We doubled or tripled our ICU and respiratory intensive care unit activity at that time. We've tested more than 27,000 patients and have had about 1,250 positive tests to date. Our state has confirmed about 76,000 or probable cases. I think it's important to note that COVID-19 is far from gone. Globally, there are hot spots across continents, and there have been nearly 13 million confirmed cases and close to 570,000 deaths, very tragically. In the US, everybody knows who follows the news, we are seeing more COVID-19 flare-ups, particularly where stay-at-home restrictions have been lifted and masks and social distancing recommendations either are not being followed or are not required. While many of us are pleased to have our own state opening back up, we need to remain vigilant about social distancing, wearing masks, and hand hygiene. Right now, we are increasing clinical activity, the usual clinic activity, while preserving and implementing a lot of operational innovations that we learned during the pandemic and preparing for a potential second wave. These include expanded inpatient services, streamlined transfer processes, expanded intensive care unit capacity. We absolutely grew virtual care, and we're going to keep virtual care as an active platform at Michigan Medicine. We've got expedited ambulatory access, expanded network partnerships throughout the state, and are really looking to innovate home-based programs and care. So never waste a crisis to innovate and transform. I do want to thank all of you who have helped us so much during this unprecedented time. Many of you and many in our communities have helped with meals, coffee, and snacks, donating the vitally needed personal protective equipment. And many of you have contributed to the Employee Emergency Needs Fund and the COVID Philanthropic Fund, as well as support for our students and learners during this time. We could not have done all of this without you. So thank you. It's really a great privilege and honor to be with you all today. And now I think we go back to our moderator.
Yes, you do. Thank you, Dr. Bradford, for giving us the inside scoop on Michigan coronavirus. I think I speak for everybody in the state of Michigan and beyond. Our deepest thanks to all of the people at Michigan Medicine who have really put themselves on the line to help us in this crisis, which is ongoing and will continue, and we will continue to need them. So I hope that they hear from us in different forms of how grateful we are. With that, I am going to turn now to our next guest, Dean Jonathan Overpack. Dr. Overpack, who is more commonly known as Peck, is the Samuel A. Graham Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability, and that is fondly referred to as SEAS. He's an interdisciplinary climate scientist, having led active climate research programs on 5 continents. His research is focused on mega-drought dynamics and risks the world over, among many other climate-based topics. He has appeared and testified before Congress multiple times and is a fellow of the AGU and the American Association. Dean Overpack, welcome.
Looking forward to question and answers. And the way I thought I would start off today, there's a lot of curiosity around what climate change is doing to the planet, in particular what it's doing to the Great Lakes. So it's a real pleasure to join you all and talk about the challenges and opportunities. And note that most people, when they talk about climate change, they like to talk about the challenges. But I like to talk about the opportunities as well. I grew up in Michigan, and I married into a Michigan family, spent a lot of time up north. But most recently, I came from Arizona, where I spent the longest period of my career. And once you've been to the Southwest US, one of the things you realize is that the Great Lakes may really have an opportunity, and that's what I want to talk about. If you are a snowbird and you go to the Southwest, you've no doubt noticed there's a lot of talk about water shortages now and drought. The Southwest is in a mega drought that includes major cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Denver and Salt Lake and Albuquerque, but also over in California, sharing the water of the Colorado River, San Diego and LA. And the river flows in the Colorado have gone down about 20% in the last 20 years. And the same thing's happening in other rivers in the Southwest. And as a result, people are starting to pump groundwater, which is a fossil resource, meaning it's not sustainable. So there's big water problems coming to the Southwest, as well as other parts of the country, including the High Plains breadbasket. More recently, this would have been a view from my old house in Arizona, looking up into the mountains just north of town. There was a major fire. And what you're seeing across the West, of course, in California, it's really been the worst, where whole communities and lots of deaths have occurred. We're getting a huge increase in wildfire as the West essentially aridifies. And that aridification is moving towards the east. And as it goes, the water supplies are getting more dear, and the vegetation is also drying out and burning, and a number of other things are happening. So the West is getting hit much harder by climate change, and sort of the sharp edge of climate change in the United States. But it's not alone. Another place that really is getting hit hard is the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. And it's a 1-2 punch, really, a 1-2-3 punch of rising seas, caused mostly by the warming ocean expanding, as well as melting of snow and ice around the planet, particularly in the large ice sheets in the north and southern polar regions. And you're also getting a strengthening of the large tropical storms and hurricanes. And because the atmosphere, as it warms, can hold a lot more moisture, this is a story we'll be talking about with respect to Michigan in a second, because the atmosphere can hold more moisture, you're getting a lot more rain associated with the big tropical storms and hurricanes when they hit. So it's not just the winds that are getting stronger because of the warmer ocean powering bigger storms, it's they're raining a lot more and they're stalling. And that combined with sea level rise is causing dramatic increase in flooding along much of the southeast coast. And you're also, of course, getting very warm, unprecedented heat waves now, much hotter than you used to get. So there are parts of the country, particularly along the whole southern tier, that for a variety of reasons are getting less and less habitable and less conducive to a strong economy. So that's really an opportunity for us up here in the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes themselves hold 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh water. And that is going to be increasingly a resource, not necessarily to be used without great care, but nonetheless, that means that we have a much more sustainable water supply for agriculture and other purposes than does a large part of our country where we now do a lot of our growing. And as all of you know, in summer, this is the place to be. And in winter, those winters are getting warmer as well. So it looks bright for Michigan. I think more people are going to want to move here. And at the University of Michigan, the colleges across campus, the Graham Institute, others are teaming up to create an initiative to see if we can speed the transition, not just to a more climate resilient campus, but to a 21st century economy in the Great Lakes region that is more sustainable and just for the people who live here. One where we will thrive just as much as on the east and west coasts where people are thriving. Big difference being on those coasts, it's getting very unaffordable to live. And I think a lot of the talent that really fuels the economy will want to move to Michigan. That is, assuming we allow Michigan to stay a great place. And that's where we really have to start talking about the climate challenge in our state. Those of you who have been swimming in the Great Lakes know that we're getting record warm temperatures this year in the water of the Great Lakes. Some of the Great Lakes in southern Erie and southern Lake Michigan, Saginaw Bay, over 80 degrees Fahrenheit this year. It's really warming up. And we've already warmed up the over land as well, and agriculture is seeing that. We're seeing a lot more irrigated agriculture as a result of warmer dry spells and the need to irrigate. But if we let this climate change go unchecked, the warming will be about 6 times what it's been so far by the end of the century. And we'll also be able to boast of having 40 or more days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in southern Michigan. And those of you who spend time here, I think almost everyone has, but more recently know that it's getting pretty hot and humid here now. And it reminds me a lot of my time in Arizona, where it's a dry heat. But here with that humidity, it's really can get pretty uncomfortable. But the big story for the Great Lakes is what's happening to our precipitation. I'm showing you 2 maps here. The one on the left is showing the trends in precipitation over the United States. And you can see some brown colors down in the Southwest where it's drying out, and elsewhere around the West where we're really getting aridification as the dominant signal. But here in the Great Lakes region, we're seeing an increase in the average precipitation per year. So both in the winter and in the summer, particularly in the spring and winter actually, we're getting more and more snow and rain. And that means, of course, several things. You've already seen the result, I think everybody, from the look of the questions people have been asking prior to this event. The lake levels in the Great Lakes are all at record highs. This is because we're getting a lot more precipitation now. And the warming, which should cause greater evaporation to counterbalance that precipitation, just isn't doing it. So that's one reason why we're getting much more, I'd say, destructive lake levels in the Great Lakes. But there's another thing going on, and that's the map on the right. And this shows in big circles with white numbers, the percentage increase in the amount of precipitation occurring in the heaviest 1% of events. So this is a measure of how hard the rain and snow is coming down, particularly the rain, not just the average amount. The average amount of precipitation is going up, but it's also coming in much more extreme events. And this is why we had last year flooding in Detroit, a really tough time for farmers getting going in much of Michigan because their fields were flooded out in the spring. This is why we had 2 dams burst in Michigan this year. I mean, there are other contributors, of course, but the big cause is that we're getting more intense precipitation. We're getting more precipitation. All of this was predicted by climate scientists well over a decade ago, and will continue to get worse and worse if we allow climate change to go unchecked. So we're seeing the high lake levels. Here's a picture that I think many people will know up in Lake Michigan on the left, and the flooding due to the dam bursts on the right. And as experts said, and have been saying for a long time now, let climate change go unchecked. We're just going to get more and more of flooding, and in many cases, disastrous flooding. But there are other things that happen when we get more and more precipitation. One of those is that our infrastructure in the Great Lakes is old infrastructure. This means sewage and stormwater infrastructure in particular in our urban areas, but also our rural areas, isn't designed for this amount of water or the rain that comes down so fast. Moreover, we have these harmful algal blooms, we call it, cyanobacteria, in lakes like Erie, where this is actually poisonous, toxic algae. If it gets bad enough, it forces cities like Toledo to cut off their water supply. And this is caused by increased runoff of agricultural nutrients, fertilizer essentially, into the lakes. And if you get enough of this intense precipitation, you get more stuff washing into the lakes, and that's where you get the algal blooms, which now, by the way, are occurring in all our Great Lakes, and will get a lot worse, particularly along coastlines, because the other thing that the algae needs to thrive are warmer temperatures. Lo and behold, we're getting warmer temperatures because of global warming. So this is a bad sign if we want pristine Great Lakes, and the only way to stop it is to stop climate change. And I'm going to end by just highlighting something else that's relevant to the COVID disaster or pandemic that we're now going through. And as Michiganders, we all know that we were hard hit, particularly in our cities. One of the reasons we were hard hit is because our populations, particularly in urban areas of Michigan, were predisposed to higher mortality associated with the coronavirus because they've been breathing really bad air pollution. And the really bad air pollution, you can see the areas of Michigan that are getting this now in red, and there are other parts of the country as well. This is because of fossil fuel burning, cars, factories, other industry, but mainly cars burning fossil fuels. So if we tackle climate change, we get the bonus of getting rid of this pollution. And one of the interesting things of the COVID experience is that the air quality in Beijing, in New Delhi, and in Southeast Michigan cleaned up as a result of the economy crashing. And in the future, I'm certainly not advocating for a crashing economy, but we can have an economy that's very strong in Michigan, fueled by renewable energy that cleans up our air, not just our global climate. So the bottom line for Michigan and the Great Lakes, well, we could do a lot more business in the future. We could become a desired place for the talent and others who are needed to drive that business and that economy. It could be a sustainable economy. It could be an economy that is just, but we have to have the will to do this. And if we don't do it, if we don't embrace renewable energy, we don't fight climate change, then some of the negative consequences that we're already starting to see in our region and in our lakes are going to only get worse and worse. And we will be a sacrifice area just like much of the rest of the country. So with that, I'd like to say we got a real impetus, a real reason to get active on climate change. And I want to thank you all for hopefully playing a role in making that happen. Thank you very much, and go blue.
Thank you, Peck. That's really sobering. He sits on the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality. His expertise really runs extremely deep. We need him as a resource. So now I am pleased to introduce Jennifer Haverkamp, the Graham Family Director of the Graham Sustainability Institute. As director, she helps facilitate sustainability-focused collaborations across and beyond our campuses. She comes to this diplomatic role with lots of experience. Director Haverkamp is a professor from practice at Michigan Law and with a focused interest on international environmental law, climate change, and global environmental policy. Among many distinguished roles prior to coming to Michigan, Director Haverkamp has served as ambassador to the U.S. Department of State. I think I should call her Ambassador Haverkamp, negotiating international agreements on water, carbon emissions, and natural resources. I'm also pleased to count her as a close colleague as the co-chair of the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality. So Jennifer Haverkamp, welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that kind introduction. You are indeed a wonderful colleague to be trying to address climate change here at the University of Michigan with, and Peck as well. And Peck, thanks so much for your remarks, which are both sobering and encouraging. And I thank everyone else who's joined us here today. Lots of you this afternoon have been supporting our programs. We appreciate that support very much. What I thought I would do today is mostly focus on ways that folks here at the University of Michigan are trying to avoid the dark future that Peck spelled out through some of the great work that is being done at the Graham Institute, at SEAS, and other parts of the university. But before I started, I thought I would just briefly, for those of you who don't know us, tell you a little bit about my institute. The Graham Sustainability Institute was founded in 2006 by a very generous gift from Don Graham, a graduate of the School of Engineering, in honor of his father, who was a professor at the School of Natural Resources, the predecessor to SEAS. Our mission is here on this slide. We catalyze and facilitate sustainability-focused collaborations with faculty, students, external stakeholders, meaning communities, governments, tribes, NGOs, companies. Our role is to link knowledge to real-world impact. We support collaborative teams across all these different topics. We are known as what's called a boundary organization, but think of us as boundary spanning, not a wall between at the border. And we are located in the office of the provost so that we can work with all the different schools and colleges across the university, which we do. So I thought I would pick up on what Peck was saying around some of the opportunities and challenges facing Michigan and the region as we try to move toward a low carbon future. And in particular, I wanted to talk about renewable energy and what some of the opportunities and challenges in Michigan, in particularly in rural Michigan, that presents. We have right now about 2 gigawatts of solar and wind across the state. You can see that in the map on the slide. And there are lots of organizations who are trying to get into this business and build out more. We produce more solar power now, power from renewables, solar and wind, than from coal. And that's the first time since the 1880s that was true. Renewables are cheaper than coal. Wind is a very cheap form of electricity. Solar, the price of solar has dropped 90% just in the last decade, I think. So you have increased pressure on our utilities to move away from their coal-fired power plants. So DTE and consumers have both announced targets for, in the next several decades, getting their mix down from coal and eventually also mostly their natural gas for electricity production. So there is enormous pressure to build out these resources in the state. Looking beyond Michigan, you have the governors of Wisconsin and Minnesota who announced, I believe, 100% targets for renewable energy by 2050. We heard that Governor Whitmer was on the verge of a similar announcement right before COVID hit and her speech was canceled, but I think that's an ambition for this state as well. And I haven't read yet the plan that presidential candidate Biden announced this morning, but if there were a change of administration, I think you'd also see enormous federal pressure to ramp up renewable energy everywhere. So this is great. We've got a lot in the planning here in the state. For solar, there's 6 megawatts planned of utility scale solar, another 3 gigawatts of smaller projects, and also a lot of wind happening. So, but there are challenges to this, a couple of them. Some I'll get back to in terms of why we can't just rely on solar looking toward the future. Part of that is that while solar is great for addressing when our peak is right now, which is in the summer, if we manage to, in the future, convert our heating in the region from burning natural gas to electrification for our thermal uses, then we will also have a significant electricity peak in the winter. And solar power is not as efficient in the winter. So we'll need to be figuring out other sources of renewables down the road. But what are the issues and what are we doing at the Graham Institute to try to speed up this transition? One is that the rural communities in Michigan face a lot of questions around what role they will play in this renewable energy transition. And Dr. Sarah Mills at Graham is working on this by helping to make sure the rural communities consider the benefits, the costs to them of this, and so that they make the zoning decisions they need to. Zoning, as you may know, is done at the township level. We've got almost 200 townships. Most of those zoning officials have not thought about whether they want to site wind or solar in the state. This map shows all the tan on the left are the townships that don't have solar zoning in place yet. So we are trying to help them figure out what are the benefits. And there are benefits, especially if they are able to, say, charge local taxes for the solar. You might think that it's better to get this source ramped up if we don't tax it. But on the other hand, then it's not of a benefit to the local community and they might decide that they don't want it sited there. And local communities have a lot of say on where these might get sited. One of the things that Sarah is doing is actually bringing together the stakeholders across the state, the farming communities, the companies, to have a dialogue around what should the solar tax policy be for solar energy in the state. Another thing that I would say is with these rural communities, it's a real opportunity for the farmers to get additional income when the wind turbines or the solar arrays are placed on their property. But she's doing some research with a colleague at SEAS. It's possible that at some point you have too much of the farmland put into the renewables and some of the surrounding economy, like the farm equipment businesses and things like that, might fail. So you really have to take a bigger look at what the economic impacts are of this move. Another thing that we've done is we have a group of students who a couple of years ago worked with the Michigan Land Bank to look at what are the opportunities for siting solar on brownfields. In other words, the degraded land in urban areas, so that we're not necessarily taking farmland out of production for this. But there are a lot of policy and other barriers that they discovered to doing that. But we'll see where that all goes. Moving on to, this is just a summary of some of what we're doing in Sarah's work. I think I covered this already. We're also helping the rural communities with their planning and identifying where the state policies are hindering their decision making. So the other thing I wanted to especially talk about is the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, which Steve already mentioned. This is real leadership by President Schlissel to make sure that Michigan is part of the solution. Our commission is charged with developing a path to carbon neutrality and setting a timeline for that. Most notably, our solutions are supposed to be environmentally sustainable, involve the regional community, and create scalable and transferable models. So this again is when Michigan figures out some of the solutions, we will help the rest of the region to get there as well. It's what we mean by carbon neutrality, I'll just briefly say, that means not necessarily just all renewable energy. It means reducing your emissions and finding ways to absorb emissions to get to neutrality. And that involves several different tactics, which I won't go over. Our commission is pretty complicated. We have over 100 people working on these different units and subgroups and research teams that we put together. We are to make our recommendations by December to President Schlissel. We have doing a lot of consultation with the public along the way. Some of the reasons why this is bold and you should be proud of the university for tackling this are that for the other schools that have taken this on, I don't know of any of the other ones that have a hospital system within the scope of what they're trying to do. We are also charged with coming up with recommendations, not only for the Ann Arbor campus, which is one of the largest in the world, but also for Flint and for Dearborn. And as I mentioned, we're in a cold climate, so we don't have the advantages of Stanford or the UC Berkeley in terms of not having to worry about how to heat our buildings in the winter. Briefly, here are some of the emissions, the types of emissions we're talking about. It's not only the electricity and the heating that we generate with our own power plant, it's also the electricity we purchase from DTE and from consumers. And it's also what's called scope 3 emissions, the ones that are hard to measure and hard to get a handle on, some of them. Things like the emissions from our waste and water disposal, from people commuting to and from the campus. This is one that really bugs faculty. How do we reduce the emissions from all the flying that they do around the country and the world to their conferences? Do we have to buy offsets? Can we do more of the virtual meetings like we're having today? So those are all the different kinds of things that we are trying to address through our Carbon Neutrality Commission. Another new initiative the university is taking on is we're launching just later this week something we're calling the Carbon Neutrality Acceleration Program. This is a generous gift from an anonymous donor that President Schlissel has asked us to set up a faculty research fund to accelerate faculty work in this area, bringing in new faculty, bringing in faculty who have new ideas they want to try, so that it contributes to the other work and complements the other work being undertaken all across the campus to make sure that University of Michigan really is a leader in this area. I think that I'm running out of time, so I don't think I'll put in a lot more what I could say about our water center at the Institute. One of the things, just to pick up on what Peck had said about the algae blooms, we had a study that showed that a lot of the phosphorus, 54% of the phosphorus that was going into Lake Erie actually was coming from the Lake Huron Basin and going through St. Clair and into Lake Erie. So when you think about solutions, you really need to go upstream and do this kind of research and analysis to make sure that the farmers' practices are being changed in the areas that most matter. And I think with that, this is just a slide of all the different ways that we work with students at Graham. Our students do interdisciplinary projects that include a lot of work around climate change adaptation and mitigation as well. Thank you very much. Go Blue. Steve, Peck and I can't wait to answer your questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and if you haven't already, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll direct the questions to Peck and Jennifer as we go forward. First one, I think I'll throw Peck's way, because you talked a lot about the lakes as a water system, which of course they are. They're much more than that. And there's questions that the rising water levels are really quite scary, particularly to homeowners, beach erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So the question that is coming is, do we expect these high water levels to become the norm? And to go one step further with that, there have been in the past some climate models that have predicted drought rather than an abundance of water. So I would like to hear your comments on that. I know it's on a lot of the people's minds here who are attending this event.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. One of the things I want to sort of key it into the Q&A as well. Someone has asked a question, Claire, about what you can do to manage the higher lake levels. And after this webinar is over, you'll be sent a notice for webinar that some of my colleagues are organizing at Michigan Sea Grant, which is a SEAS program in partnership with Michigan State University. And there's a webinar coming up next week that will be talking about what you can do about these high lake levels, you know, engineering solutions and things like that. Lately, we've been getting a lot more precipitation. It's warmed up, so that means more evaporation as well, but the precipitation's clearly winning out. And that's why our lake levels are so high. And we have really the expert on this, a couple of them at the University of Michigan. One of them, they both work in my school and also in engineering. And they sense that the thing we know best is that as the atmosphere warms and it can hold more moisture, this is the same thing that's fueling you know, more flooding associated with hurricanes. You can get more variation in we call it the hydrologic cycle. So you can get more extreme wet periods and more extreme dry periods at the same time. And you can think of it as you might get a couple-year period where it's drier than normal. And because it's warmer than normal, it'll be that much drier. So in the future, the dry periods will be drier and the wet periods will be wetter. And we're in a wet period now. Overall, though, we're also seeing just a trend to more and more precipitation. So I personally think that that's something more to worry about is higher lake levels. But I agree with my colleagues that there ought to be periods when it gets drier and the lake levels will drop. And that's a good reason, by the way. I think someone's asked me whether we should be moving water out of the Great Lakes and maybe sharing it with the Southwest or other parts of the country that need it. People in the Southwest joke about that. I don't think they're serious. So they'll go to the Columbia River, or they'll go to the Missouri River, or they'll go to the Mississippi River before they'll come to the Great Lakes for water. And we don't want to get anyone else hooked on our water, because there are going to be times when the Great Lakes are also going to be low and we'll need it. So I hope that helps answer the question. We don't have a definitive answer, but we think there'll be more highs and more lows. And for sure, drought is a problem for Michigan, much as it is already a drought problem out west. We could start to see droughts that have a lot more impact in the east as well in the Great Lakes, just because the temperatures are getting warmer. And this is an area where I do a lot of my own research.
Thanks, Pat. There were also several questions having to do with the biological health of the lakes, particularly invasive species. I went to graduate school in Michigan in the 70s, and there were concerns about, I think, sea lampreys was the thing at the time. We have the algae blooms, and now we have the Asian carp. And so I think, Jennifer, you talked a bit about the algal blooms. Can you give us a feeling for how endangered the biological health of the lakes are and what we can do, and how successful have we been in keeping the Asian carp out of the lakes?
Thanks, Steve, for that question, and I'll take a crack at it. And for those interested in delving deeper in this topic, there's really a wonderful book called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, which goes through wave after wave of invasive species, some of which we introduced intentionally, others which came in accidentally. and the really powerful and negative impacts many of them have had on the lakes over the decades since the Great Lakes were opened up to the St. Lawrence Seaway and species could come in. With respect to the Asian carp, as best I understand the research right now, they are not yet believed to be in the Great Lakes. There is some indication of some studies that there are traces of their DNA have been found on some of the other sides of the barriers, but that could come in by a variety of different means, not necessarily living fish. But they have worked their way up the Mississippi River and through the tributaries, and they're really on the doorstep in Chicago at the Illinois River, and there are barriers there to try to keep them out. They are voracious, they outcompete a lot of native species, and so if if they did get in, they would potentially be very destructive. And so it's very important for people who fish in the lakes to learn what they look like, and if you ever catch one that might be one, you take pictures of it, you certainly don't throw it back in, you notify the DNR people. But there's a study that was done by folks here at the university that just came out last week that is relevant to the relationship between the Asian carp and climate change. And that is that the young fry, the young carp, eat algae, other basic plankton at the bottom end of the food chain. And people thought that the trillions of quagga mussels that we have in the Great Lakes, which are also an invasive species, were basically an ecological barrier to the Asian carp getting established, because the mussels were eating the algae and they wouldn't be a very accessible food supply. But Peter Alsop at the University of Michigan has figured out that as these lakes are warming, as you saw from Peck's slide, it means that the stratification of the lakes happens earlier and earlier in the spring, and it separates the fry from the mussels. And so if we have the global warming we're expecting, we're even more vulnerable to the Asian carp than people had thought they might be. It's also true that the increased stormwater that you heard about is the phosphorus that's going in is not just creating toxic algae that's horrible to swim in, it's also a food source for these species. So I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but I think we all have to be vigilant. Thanks.
So we're running out of time, but I'll give you one last quick question. Maybe you could both take a stab at it. Maybe Jennifer, since I have you online, you can go first. You know, in terms of the greatest threats to the Great Lakes, is there any pending legislation we should support? We have 150 people at this meeting, so if you've got some ideas, let us know.
I would say that the greatest threats to the Great Lakes are the legislation that we don't have pending yet, which is legislation at the federal, state, and local levels all across the country to really address climate change, because climate change is a huge threat to the lakes themselves and the region. Certainly, we will need to be vigilant if anyone tries to pass legislation to irresponsibly deplete our water supply. We would want to make sure that doesn't happen, but I don't know of any that's on the verge of passing at the moment. Peck?
You said it very well, Jennifer. I would totally agree with you. Climate change is the biggest threat to our region and to our lakes. I think it's also really important to keep in mind that whatever solutions we find to climate change, we need to be equitable and ensure that everyone benefits. And I think that is likely the case if we do this right. And University of Michigan, a lot of the schools and institutes and colleges are working in that direction. If everyone benefits, then everyone will support it. And certainly one thing that's bipartisan in this state are the Great Lakes. Clean water is another one. Another one is a strong economy. And our goal is to try and see if we can pull off all of three of those things. And at the same time that we essentially stop the climate from changing and hopefully preserve our great region and what we love about it.
Thank you both very much. I found your presentations really inspiring. I hope everybody else did. I'm going to turn this over to Tom to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for facilitating the event today. And I want to thank Carol Bradford, Jonathan Overpack, and Jennifer Haverkamp for sharing their insights with us today. I know I learned a great detail. I hope you did as well. It's one of the great elements of my job is I get to be a student every day. So thank you all so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us in this virtual event today. We look forward to hearing your feedback as we look to host many more of these events in the coming weeks ahead of us. We appreciate your interest in this topic and all the things that are happening at Michigan. We thank you for all that you do for the University of Michigan. I hope you have a great summer. Thanks for being here today, and go Blue.